Good morning. I hope you've had a pleasant morning, as have I. What I was told, just so you know the truth versus fiction, I was told that the Britnell family would not be here today. He would like me to take a lesson, in which case I could do whatever I do and he wouldn't be here to create that added pressure. I told him it was like fixing a carburetor with your father-in-law right over your shoulder. And then they decided to be here, so that's terrible. But that's okay. That is okay. I found out later that neither Barry nor myself technically has been to the city of Hebron, and that's where we're going to spend most of our study this morning. I know that our numbers here in the local classroom are not always high, but we have viewership through YouTube, and so we would like to welcome you as we begin this study. Although it will be brief, we'll continue it on Wednesday. And I encourage you, if you do have questions, whether it's for myself or whether it's for Barry, please feel free to stop me and ask me any questions you might have. If you're opening your books, open to 2 Samuel chapter 1. Here in a moment we're going to go over, I suppose, what you would call a review. What we are reviewing is we're really reviewing the purpose of the city of Hebron, how the city of Hebron rests in biblical folklore, biblical historical documents, and also recognizing its geographical features. As we do this, we have to know, number one, where it is, and number two, exactly what we're talking about. I did something. I suppose it's a bit foolish. I tried it out anyways. Before we get to the reading, I wanted to put this up just so, I think the term I used when I was going over this in my mind is so that we could get our bearings straight. And we use this a lot when we're talking about what we're studying, where it is on the globe. I put a map. Oh, I went the wrong way. Okay. Okay. So I'll put, and I'm going to step away from the podium a little bit, try not to fall. I'll put a map. Now, it is not beyond me that the map is neither centered nor is it large enough. There is a purpose. But if you look at this map, what am I showing you a map of? Anybody but Barry.
Is that modern Israel?
What's that?
Is it modern Israel? Or is it just
Just Israel, right? Don't overthink it. It's simple. So it's a map of Israel. And when you look at Israel, Israel is divided from a modern standpoint into a few different groups of land. Can anyone, based on Barry using the term over and over again, guess at some of these areas of Israel? They're written on the board. I'll throw one out there. We may use the term very often. We may use the term the Golan Heights, right? What's another term that you can see up there in red or in black? Yep, we see the Gaza Strip, right, down on the coastline where the modern-day Philistines and Arabs occupy. What other area do you see? We certainly see Jerusalem, and we see Jerusalem falls between the two borders of what groups or what types of land inside of Israel. It's the land that is yellow and the land that is really orange. Barry?
Israel and what's commonly referred to as the West Bank.
So, The yellow being Israel and the orange being more what they would call the West Bank. And don't be confused either, because sometimes you think this. There are many, many Jews that are in settlements on the West Bank, but for all intents and purposes, after 1976, where they began to parcel out the land, this was essentially the agreement that they came to. Now, that really doesn't have anything to do with our lesson today, except to notate that Hebron is right here in the West Bank, so we kind of know where it is. And if it's right here, and Jerusalem is right here, they're very close. What I thought was interesting was on multiple occasions, Barry would make the statement of something like, you know, Israel is not really bigger than the state of Alabama. It's more like half of the state of Alabama. What I made a very, very childish attempt to do was to superimpose the state of Alabama over this so you could see, if we were dabbling around in counties in the Alabama area, what it would look like to have those to scale laid on top of one another. If both of the maps are to a 40-mile scale, and I know there's a lot of lines, I'm going to try to clean them up for you. But just to give you an example, if we are worshiping this morning, or we're studying the Bible, we're doing so right on that border where the number 2 is. Almost the dead center of the map where the number 2 is. So you just call that Capshaw. If we're at Capshaw right now, we essentially have a position where we can see the Golan Heights and the mountains surrounding the Galilean River, or the Galilean Lake. So if that puts us here, and you sojourn all the way through where Mount Carmel is on your left, and you're through the Jezreel Valley towards the Jordan Valley, you get to the busiest part of Israel. Happens to also be the busiest part of the state. So Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Hebron, they happen to match up with Alabaster, Hoover, Fultondale. That kind of gives you an idea of the scope of travel that these men are undergoing. And if you were to get really fancy with it, you could notice that you could be in Jackson County, still be in the Golan Heights, but be in the Syrian Arab Republic. If you wanted to go down to, I guess the farthest I could think was Eufaula. I don't even know if you've been to Eufaula, but if you were to travel to Eufaula or southeast of Auburn, you would find yourself in Jordan, deep in Jordan, actually. And then if you came down here and you decided you want to go to the beach and you followed 65, which ironically would follow just to the left of the Dead Sea, you're going to find yourself in Egypt before you get to the beach. I really only put that up there because in my mind as a child, when I studied these states, these Arab states, I pictured Israel. And it says, and Jesus took the journey up to the mountain alone to pray. I mean, up a mountain alone to pray. How long could that have taken? 2 days? 3 days? When you really come to grips with the idea that the state of Israel was rather small. And the state of Alabama, as small as it is for a state, it still takes 7 hours and 10 minutes to drive, from head to toe. And so this is a really confusing way of looking at it, but from a per scale equivalency, this should give you a pretty good idea when we start talking about what happened at Hebron. I want to point it out again. Hebron's going to be dead center of the map, right there in the heart of the West Bank. When we look at Hebron and all the things that went on in Hebron, you should be able to say, okay, I know where that is. That's not that far from Jerusalem. That's not that far from Bethlehem. That's really not that far from En-Gedi and the Dead Sea. You just got to keep that in your mind. If we have to, we'll pull this back up. When I was studying, I found it to be very helpful. Any questions before I kind of just skim over this too quickly? I have to have some questions. I'll finish early. So I asked the question when we were going through the material. As far as David is concerned, why Hebron? What's that?
God told him to.
Or so the very opening verse, where do we see that first commandment, Doug?
The end of verse 1. He asked God where he needed to go from to heaven.
Yeah, I think David literally said, should I go up to Judah? God said, sure. Where? He said, Hebron. Now, when he said Hebron, what would have been the historical significance to David and his fathers? And there is a wrong answer, so I might just point at you and say wrong, but there's a lot of right answers. What happened at Hebron? And if you don't know, you may be pleasantly shocked. What happened at Hebron? Just give me one.
Abraham purchased a cave.
Abraham purchased Machpelah, yeah. That'll be the last one that we pull up here in a second because it's really part of the localized myth that they have now. And it's not really myth, it probably is true, but what else? Go farther back before Abraham died. I can hear you whisper. You just got to say it out
Abraham
loud.
lived there for a long time.
Yeah, this was Abraham's home. He even had a nickname for it. What did he call it? I mean, everyone called it this. You remember this? The Oaks of Mamre. I looked at a lot of pictures. It's not obvious to me that they just happen to be a lot of oak trees, near Hebron. But there must have been at one time because they were obvious enough that the place became known as the Oaks of Mamre. They probably were old, large trees. Abraham lived there. If he lived there, what events would have taken place in Abram's home? There's plenty. You can just rattle them off.
He and Sarah's names were changed from Abram and Sarah to Abraham and Sarah.
Visited by an angel to change his wife's name? Yeah, that's quite an event. I mean, Lauren and I like the place we live. But if we had been visited by an angel, it would probably save in that house. Probably saving that house. And not only that, but when the angel visited, changed her name, what proclamation was made by the angel? How old was she? Nobody knows? She was in her 80s, right? If there were a woman here, visited by an angel and said, I bring great tidings, you will be having a baby in 9 months, we would all laugh, right? We would all laugh. The miracle that was performed on Abram's family was amazing. To say the least, it was amazing. This was in his home. Don't forget, this was Hebron. This is in his home. What else happened in Hebron? How often do you guys talk about the story of Jacob and Isaac? Isaac and Esau. Remember Isaac and Esau? Nobody? You guys don't remember that? Tell me a little bit about it. What happened to Esau? Yeah. Esau loses his birthright. Basically, the history of the nation looks like it's about to change. And indeed it does, because the lineage that has been foretold, is coming through Jacob. That's right. And so I think sometimes we forget, we tell these stories, we read of these narratives that take place in the Bible, and they're interesting narratives, but rarely do we stop and say, okay, hang on one second. So where is this happening right now? Which is actually kind of unnatural. Because if you're trying to remember something that happened to you in daily life, if you say something to the effect of, man, you remember when we were on vacation and we lost Molly and we couldn't find her for like 8 hours? Normally, Lauren will go, oh yeah, Universal Studios. Because whatever reason, we didn't lose Molly at Universal Studios. It was John. But usually when you have events, they are tied to locations. And so you say, I remember that. I was at fill in the blank. We even do that with events that don't have anything to do with us. I dare say that I could ask people to raise their hands and they know where they were when the plane struck the towers on 9/11. Because I knew where I was. And it had almost nothing to do with me. And so I'm telling you some of the stories that are at the root of Judeo-Christian values, and you don't know what city they took place in. And it's not a critique. I didn't know either. But it's a wonderful reminder to say, if you want to go back to basics and dig through these scriptures, which is never a bad thing to do, and remember in your mind, I know where I was when this took place. Mentally, anyways, I was in Hebron. Hebron is a super valuable city. Lots happened in Hebron. And today I want to talk about why that was the case. This is mentioned less, but also Hebron came to be known as Kirjath Arba, and at Kirjath Arba was where Caleb received the blessing of the inheritance of the kingdom after walking in the wilderness. And so Hebron has importance and significance from that standpoint, but really you have like bookmarks on the ends of the history of the wilderness and the history of the capture and the colonization of Canaan. And essentially at each side of the bookmark, you have something that looks like really Jerusalem on one side and Hebron on the other. I think that's worth noting. Questions or comments before we move forward? Somebody already mentioned it. Machpelah is the burial place of Abraham, and I didn't even bother taking pictures and showing it. I've not been there. I asked Barry if he had been there, so maybe he could share some pictures. He's not been there. I have no idea whether that happens to be a place that is allegedly more historically relevant than others. There are a lot of places as you travel in Israel that they will tell you this place is where Jesus stopped on his walk to Calvary to have the sweat and blood wiped from his face, when we know that wasn't the case because, you know, you're 40 feet above the road where said event would have happened. I've not looked at this enough. Besides just investigating, it does appear to be a 3,000-year-old tomb that they have developed and covered. And so, was it Abraham's? I don't know. It's a very, very wealthy man's tomb in Machpelah. So, it's one worth noting because would it have been important to David? Of course. If he thinks his forefathers are buried there and then he's ruling from there, then of course it is holy to him. It's critical to him. I mentioned that Hebron was historically important. What about geographically? As we look, and I know I showed you the map. I showed you the map, and the map probably didn't do it justice. and I may skip back there a little bit. So, I pointed it out, if Hebron is in the heart of the West Bank and Bethlehem's right on the edge and Jerusalem is in Judea, what would have been geographically important about Hebron? Look at its location. Look where it's close to. Consider enemies of Israel. Consider where David would have been for the last 7 years of his reign. What city was he reigning from? Since we just covered this.
First seven, Hebron.
Before Hebron. Somebody said it. Ziklag, yeah. So he's already on the Philistine side of the kingdom. This gives him a place where he is, and you can't see it here on the, you're going to see it here shortly, but you can't see it on the map because the map is in 2D. But what do we have in between Hebron and Bethlehem and the Dead Sea? Mountains, wilderness, kind of have a natural blockade on one side. So that leaves to his left coastal plain with really allies that he has a relationship with. He is set up geographically to do what with regards to going north? Not everybody at once. It's too much. Yeah, I mean, I feel like he's got basically his heels towards his allies where he can be looking forward, and in his viewpoint, he's got a beautiful setting because if he's got his heels towards what are conquered territories, allies of the throne, allies of the crown, and he looks forward, he really only has the Shvela, those in the Golan Heights as he goes northward, and in the coastal cities in the mountains. And he makes quick work of them once he officially becomes king. In fact, we'll see in the next lesson, he dances all over the place where he's jumping from Jordan back over to the other side of the Jordan River. You know, he's almost in Syria. He's close. And he's making a lot of moves with some very dependable men, but geographically speaking, this gives him a wonderful vantage point to see enemies coming, to be prepared for them, and also possibly set up that kingdom that God has told him this is where you're going to be. I put this question up there having no preconceived notion that anybody would guess, or I guess be on the same mental path that I would be on. But the more and more that I read about Hebron and that I read about the occupation of Hebron by David, and here in a moment we're going to do a lot of reading. This is more intro work. I asked the question, in what way was Hebron a place that represented faith by somebody? Let me step back. What was Abraham promised? Give all of them to me.
A nation, a son, or at least through all his seed, all the nations will be blessed.
Right? Land. So we kind of fast forward. We just talked about Machpelah. When he died, what had he been given? Some land, right? A grave. What else? He had a son.
But it wasn't a great nation.
I mean, it's a nice nation, right?
Nice family.
Yeah, nice family. We actually read about his willingness to die without these prophecies yet fulfilled in Hebrews 11. What does it speak? When it speaks of Abraham, what does it speak about Abraham and commend him on in Hebrews chapter 11?
His faith.
His faith for what reason?
I think because he went not knowing where he was going or whether he just believed and did what God said, you know.
He did. He did. He went not knowing where he was going. And then what did it say about his death? Does somebody have that passage?
You look forward to the promise.
He looked
It
for.
wasn't fulfilled.
He looked forward to the promise. That didn't mean he sat on his deathbed and he went, well, you had your chance. On his deathbed, as he was prepared to pass from this earth, he looked forward to the giving of the promise that God had told him he would receive. I won't go on some weird deep dive on myself, but I can't tell you how many times someone make a promise to me, and because it doesn't happen exactly like I want it to happen, then they're dead to me. They're dead to me. That promise wasn't any good, and frankly, I'm not sure that I don't want to give up. And yet, with the faith like Abraham has, he literally died in his grave knowing the prophecies would be fulfilled. That's an example for us. If you've ever seen one, that's an example for you to increase your faith.
Well, he basically, Hebrew talks about him being a pilgrim, living in tents, but he waited for a city that God had prepared. So Abraham understood that he was able to live in the land, but he really didn't possess the land. And he was looking forward to that fulfilling promise. He had faith that God would fulfill, even if it wasn't in his own life.
Even if it wasn't in his own lifetime, seems like such an underappreciated phrase. Wonderfully said. What's
I
that?
said it was a work in progress, where,
Yeah.
it started, and it was still going and still,
Do we want our prayers, the answers to our prayers, to be works in progress?
we should.
I don't.
We want immediate,
I like answers. I don't know if you've seen that Leave It to Jeannie. I need a wiggled nose, crossed arms, and bam. I need an answer resolved.
Joseph is another example. God sent Joseph as a slave, to be a slave and in prison and all that, in order to save his family. Didn't make any sense. And 40 years passed before that was fulfilled.
Yeah, that's called clinical depression. I mean, how strong of a man do you have to be? 40 years to have a prayer answered. It shows a couple things that we're going to add as lessons at the end of the study that we have today. So it's obvious, I think, that you all could agree with me that Hebron was a place that represented faith. There's a couple other ways it represented faith, but one is illustrated by virtue of the pictures that you can take when you're at Hebron. Hebron is a city that has protection on multiple sides of its city center by way of mountains. There is a substantial well that is in the city of the center of the city, and they have these. What you see here, the part that's a little dry and barren, I've been told is a working tell. They also give tours there, but it's a working tell of where they think the old city of Hebron was. But they have these mosques, they have these synagogues, they have these church buildings dedicated to some of these men of faith, the graves of the patriarchs, Jacob and Isaac, Esau. They have stones, emblems set up in the name of those from the past. Geographically, it is a fortified city. More than 220,000 people live there now. It's a big city. So it's essentially like Montgomery, except up in the mountains. And I was going to say cleaner, but probably not. But when you look at it and you look at some of the pictures that Barry shows of Jerusalem, what stands out as being similar? What do we know about Jerusalem geographically? Surrounded by hills. What else? Is it fed by natural springs? More than one. Would you call it a fortified city? Very much so. Jerusalem was surrounded by mountains, and then in and of itself, it sat on a rather large hill or mountain. It sat on Moriah. We forget that too. We forget the importance of Moriah, and it's one of the best lessons that you can learn is who was sacrificed at the top of Mount Moriah. Yeah, only to find out that after Isaac's, sacrifice attempt took place, is you fast forward, a millennia, and magically you see the Temple Mount constructed over the very same rock. God has plans. God has plans, and sometimes they don't happen in 10 years, 2 years, 3 months, or even 40 years. They don't happen over lifetimes. It can be tough to hear of something, a blessing from God, and then to have these prophetic men say, yes, I thank you for the blessing, and I'm thankful that my grandchildren's 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 grandchildren may see it one day. I don't know. I'm not terribly attached to my children, much my grandchildren. Great-grandchildren are going to be rich? What about me? I need something. These are men of faith that look towards the future blessings that God would give them. I don't have grandchildren, but I'm sure I'm going to love them. I put this up here just kind of an overview of something we've already discussed, but we looked at the historical significance of the city, but I really want you to consider this. I feel like maybe just because I'm boring, maybe Barry will go over it and you guys can ooh and ah later, but when you really put this into the forefront of your mind and recognize the importance of Hebron, Hebron is like the backyard, of all of the goings-on of the neighborhood kids that lived in Israel for decades and decades and decades. So much happened there, and I think sometimes we take that for granted. I mean, you have a pretty good guess when you're reading through the Old Testament. If you don't know where it happened, you can say, I don't know, Hebron. And you might be right. A lot happened in Hebron, or happened around Hebron. So focus on those things. Don't be afraid to go back and look those up and see how long Abram made his home in the oaks of Mamre, and how long it became the dwelling place of Isaac and Jacob, and how long Kirjath Arba became, a place where Caleb put his tent down. And if you want to say how long Machpelah has been there, housing the burial places of Abraham's family, it's still there today. And if it's not the one that they observe, it's close. And we talked about how important from a geographical standpoint that the city would be. I made a note there that said that Hebron was also a bit of a foreboding prophecy. I say that because when we go back and we look at the map and we see Hebron, how far was Hebron from Jerusalem? I don't need like miles. way far away? No? It was really close. How long would it take you to walk from Hebron to Jerusalem? I hate to keep bringing it up, but I did think it was a good map. Just to kind of emblazon it on your memory. If Jerusalem is right here, Hebron is right here, and again, just to kind of put this thing into perspective, if we're walking really short distances, you know, I'm going to say the Dollar General store at East Limestone, and there is Capshaw. So, without the mountains, I'm going to say that it probably took somewhere around 20 minutes to walk from Hebron to Jerusalem. You had to walk over mountains, but you're walking over mountains maybe 45 minutes to get from Hebron to Jerusalem. Does that not seem like a very impending place for David to have his city, where God told him to be, where he was going to rule over the people until Jerusalem was ready for him? It seems imposing to me that all of his mighty men of valor, his troops, those that would at any given time, if he asked them to, would charge the city, take it, and make it his own. That location was close because it did two things. It tested David's faith, and it made him realize in due time, in God's time. And the other thing that it did, I believe, is it got him ready to rule from Jerusalem, because by the time he was ready to take the Ark of the Covenant up to Jerusalem and be in Zion, he essentially lived in a place that was very convenient to him. He didn't come from Egypt. He didn't even come from the West Bank or come from the coastline. He came from 25 minutes away. He walked from here down to one of the Dollar General stores. And he was ready to rule. Questions or comments? I think we have just maybe 4 minutes before we close things out. Any questions or input?
I mean, it's just my thoughts, but it's just cool. I mean, it's just cool to think back and the way that no matter how much you study, you know, there's always details to pick up on, you know, because I read these stories, and for some reason the geography never been good with me, so to have it all kind of brought out again just kind of shows how God is always He's always just kind of solidifying things and making things stand out to us and we really pay attention. And it's just cool to see how all these connections could be made just off of a city and a detail here where God tells him to go to Hebron.
Yeah, it kind of confirms his word in a way. I completely agree with Brian. A couple last things, and then I think we're out of time. These were notes that were in your lesson, and I found them really helpful. It speaks briefly of 3 houses, and it talks in the passages if you want to read these, and I would encourage you to. I read them in detail, trying to get out what I could. We really see 3 things that are happening almost at the same time, and one is the fall of Saul's house, which is sad to those that loved Saul, and it's sad to David, and then it's elating to everyone that hated Saul, and he had his haters. Barry went over and kind of gave us a lesson on when Saul died, of how many people were happy or seemed to be happy or took credit for the death of Saul because they thought it would make David happy. And ultimately what we see is this humble nature of David, and he saw Saul as one person, the anointed king of God. And until God decided to take him, that's how David was going to look at him. But ultimately, that house did fall because it was God's will. And then as we see that house fall, we see the rise of the house of David. And the rise of the house of David takes us all the way through the second book of Samuel. And Barry's going to pick up there on Wednesday, and it's a beautiful story. I mean, I feel like I could study it and teach it and hear it for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, because it is so well done and so up and down. Really, it's a thriller movie. But I wanted to leave you with the supporting house of Zuriah. I only bring that up because of the misconceptions that I have within my own mind, and I thought it would be worth bringing them up. Who was Zuriah? David's sister. I don't know why, but for a very long time, I'd always assumed that Zuriah was one of David's brothers. But she wasn't. She was a sister, and I don't know if she had any daughters, but I'll tell you what she did have. She had 3 boys who were wicked, and I mean like in a positive way. Bad to the bone sons. Some of my favorite characters in the Bible. They were David's nephews. And it was basically like, if David looked at somebody sideways, he could rely on one of his nephews to cut that person. I mean, they were real. They were real. In fact, they were kind of dangerous. And so we see David divide with them on some issues later on in his kingship. And those are also going to become part of our lesson as we continue to read, study, and evolve these scriptures. Scott, did I cover enough? Good stopping point?
Perfect stuff.
Okay, excellent. I appreciate the participation, and just for the YouTube members that are watching at home, we're going to take about a 10-minute break before we resume for worship services, but we appreciate your presence as well as everyone that joined us in person today.